I stepped into the house, the familiar warmth of Thanksgiving wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. The smell of roasting turkey mingled with cinnamon and fresh bread, and for a moment, I allowed myself to forget the undercurrents that always ran through our family gatherings. The dining room was a familiar scene. Polished table, neatly folded napkins, and my mother bustling back and forth with a careful smile. I smiled genuinely, eager to join the conversation, to laugh at the familiar jokes, to feel for once like I belonged completely. My siblings were already there, animated and confident, as if the room belonged to them. I felt the familiar pang of being slightly on the outside, a spectator to their effortless charm, and my father's approving nods aimed at them. Even as I carried my casserole dish to the table, I caught the subtle glances and small whispers exchanged between my father and my brother, a silent reminder of the favoritism that had always lurked beneath the surface. Despite it all, I tried to focus on the little traditions that had once made me feel connected. My grandmother's laughter, the clatter of silverware, the cozy hum of conversation. Yet beneath the surface, a tension simmered, a quiet, unspoken reminder that nothing here was truly equal, nothing truly fair. I could feel my father's eyes on me for just a second longer than polite, that familiar mixture of scrutiny and dismissal that never failed to make me shrink a little inside. Still, I forced myself to smile and greet everyone warmly, hoping to anchor myself in the fleeting joy of the moment. The house was alive with warmth and holiday cheer, but beneath it all, I knew the undercurrents of resentment and favoritism were already threading their way through the evening, shaping the storm that was about to unfold. I had just taken my seat at the long, polished dining table, the familiar scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling the room, when my father cleared his throat with that tone I had learned to fear over the years. Conversation faltered. The chatter, laughter, and clinking of silverware faded as all eyes turned toward him. "We're selling the family business," he announced, each word landing like a hammer. "And you're getting nothing." The words echoed in my mind, colliding with every memory of late nights spent helping with accounts, every sacrifice I had made that no one seemed to notice. My mother gasped softly. My siblings exchanged glances that betrayed a mix of shock and smug relief. I felt my stomach drop. Humiliation washed over me like icy water. All the subtle favoritism, all the times I had been sidelined, suddenly made sense. They had been preparing this moment for years. Memories of being passed over for promotions, of parents praising my brother's careless achievements while my successes went unnoticed, flared in my chest. I forced a smile, nodding mechanically as relatives murmured condolences or whispered in sympathy, none daring to challenge my father. Each passing second stretched painfully, the air thick with judgment and pity. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped my napkin, recalling all the moments I had tried to please him, only to be reminded that approval was never mine to earn. The room seemed to shrink, my heart pounding in my ears, every eye on me amplifying the weight of their disbelief. I wanted to shout, to cry, to demand justice right there, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I swallowed my outrage, feeling the first spark of something dark and purposeful ignite inside me. I would not stay powerless forever. This moment, as crushing as it was, would mark the beginning of a reckoning. The shame, the hurt, the shock, they all merged into a single, undeniable truth. I had been dismissed, but I was far from defeated. And though the family might have thought this announcement would break me, it had only lit a fire I could no longer ignore. After everyone had drifted away from the table, lingering in small clusters or retreating to the living room for dessert, I slipped quietly into the kitchen, needing the solitude. The clatter of dishes and faint laughter from the others felt distant, almost unreal. I sank into a chair, staring at my hands as the weight of the evening pressed down on me. The words my father had spoken, "You're getting nothing," replayed over and over, each repetition hammering at my sense of self. I felt a burning mix of disbelief and fury. How could he dismiss years of loyalty, sacrifice, and hard work as if they meant nothing? Memories flooded in, unrelenting and sharp. Staying late at the office to cover mistakes that weren't mine. Quietly covering for my siblings, bending over backward to earn a nod that never came. Every instance of favoritism, every ignored effort, now felt like a calculated slight, a reminder that I had always been expendable. I clenched my fists, anger pooling in my chest, and felt the sting of humiliation all over again. But beneath the hurt, a clarity began to emerge. The rage that initially threatened to consume me turned into something steadier, something strategic. This was not a defeat. It was an opening. If they thought I would remain powerless, they were gravely mistaken. My mind started spinning, mapping possibilities, subtle moves I could make, information I could gather, allies I could find. It would take patience, cunning, and courage, but I would not be sidelined any longer. I leaned back in my chair, letting the anger settle into resolve. Tonight had exposed the depth of my father's cruelty and the family's blind favoritism, but it had also ignited a spark of determination. I would plan, I would wait, and when the time was right, I would reclaim what was mine and make sure they would never forget that they had underestimated me. The next morning, I started quietly, reaching out to those I trusted most, careful to avoid raising suspicion. My phone calls and messages were measured, casual enough to seem ordinary, yet purposeful. I spoke with distant relatives who had always been on the outskirts, former colleagues who remembered the business from before my father's iron grip, and even old friends who had witnessed his manipulations firsthand. Each conversation was a thread, weaving a tapestry of knowledge I had never fully appreciated before. Slowly, the pieces began to form a picture I hadn't dared to imagine. Hidden clauses in the business contracts, documents tucked away and forgotten, revealed opportunities my father had assumed I would never uncover. Whispers of family secrets surfaced, old disputes, debts, and even mismanaged ventures that he had kept carefully hidden. Every revelation added fuel to the fire inside me, a mix of shock, validation, and determination. I took meticulous notes, cross-referencing details, tracking inconsistencies, and quietly testing who could be trusted. The suspense of discovery consumed me, each secret peeling back another layer of my father's arrogance and misjudgment. The family I had once believed was untouchable suddenly seemed vulnerable. Riddled with oversights they assumed no one would ever expose. By the end of the week, I had gathered enough information to feel a dangerous confidence building. The scales of power were no longer entirely in my father's favor. I had discovered leverage, allies, and truths that could shift the balance completely if I played my cards right. A quiet thrill coursed through me as I realized this was no longer about heartbreak alone. It was about taking back control, piece by piece, until the day came when I could finally make them all pay. I waited for the perfect moment, knowing that subtlety would be my greatest weapon. I didn't storm in or make a scene. Instead, I quietly accessed the business records I had uncovered, carefully highlighting discrepancies that even my father hadn't noticed. With a few strategic calls and emails, I froze minor transactions tied to a lucrative client, ensuring the move looked like a routine audit rather than a deliberate challenge. I watched from the sidelines, feigning casual interest, as ripples of confusion and frustration began to spread. At first, my siblings exchanged puzzled glances, whispering questions about what had happened. My father's usual air of unshakable authority faltered slightly. He answered calls tersely, a subtle edge creeping into his voice. It was enough to unsettle him without giving away my hand. For the first time, I felt the scales shift. People who had once ignored or dismissed me were now watching, calculating, wondering what had changed. Inside me, a quiet satisfaction simmered. The move was small, but it proved a point. I was no longer powerless. Every hesitant glance from family, every terse phone call, reinforced that I had disrupted the expected order. They might not know it yet, but I had planted the first seeds of change. And as I left the office that evening, a sense of control settled over me, subtle but undeniable. I was beginning to reclaim my position, and I wasn't stopping there. You said, the protagonist, discreetly. As I sat alone in my apartment that evening, memories came rushing back, unbidden and relentless. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed late at the office, crunching numbers for the family business while my siblings lounged at home, receiving praise for half-efforts I had quietly corrected. I remembered missing birthdays, anniversaries, and small moments with friends, all sacrificed in the name of duty and loyalty. Every triumph of mine had been quietly celebrated by others. while my achievements were barely noticed by the very people who should have seen me first. I flashed back to family dinners where my brother was complimented for showing up on time, while my punctuality and diligence were met with a casual nod. Holidays spent decorating, organizing, and ensuring everything went smoothly, yet the accolades always went elsewhere. I had poured myself into the family, only to be met with indifference or subtle disdain. The sting of exclusion cut deeper now, framed against the cheerful laughter of my siblings and the approving glances my father always reserved for them. I had loved them, supported them, and silently endured favoritism without complaint, believing my time and effort would someday be recognized. But now, with the inheritance stripped and my father's disdain laid bare, I felt the full weight of every slight and every overlooked sacrifice. A mix of sorrow and simmering anger settled over me. These memories weren't just reminders of past pain. They were fuel. I realized that all the effort, all the patience, all the sacrifices I had made had not been in vain. They had prepared me for this moment, for the strategy and reckoning that was quietly taking shape in my mind. And for the first time, I understood that my own strength, forged in years of being sidelined, would be the key to turning the tables. It didn't take long for my father to notice that something had shifted. His usual confidence wavered slightly in meetings, his questions sharp and probing, as if he were testing me, trying to gauge whether I was still the same obedient sidelined child he had always dismissed. I watched him from the sidelines, noting every flicker of irritation, every subtle glance that betrayed his discomfort. He tried small threats, casually mentioning how easily things could be reversed, hinting at consequences I could never anticipate. Yet I remained calm, measured, letting the unease in his voice grow without revealing a single emotion. At family gatherings, he employed social maneuvers designed to undermine me, light jokes aimed at embarrassing me in front of others, pointed comments about my past mistakes, but each attempt only reminded me how predictable he had become. I listened, observed, and carefully cataloged every word, every reaction, knowing that this behavior, meant to intimidate, was instead giving me ammunition. The underestimation that had haunted me for years now worked to my advantage. I began planting seeds of doubt among my siblings, casual remarks highlighting my knowledge and insight, just enough to make them pause and reconsider what they thought they knew. Every small victory felt electric. A lingering glance of respect, a hesitant nod, a subtle shift in the room's energy. I could feel the power dynamics tilting, slowly but unmistakably. For the first time, I wasn't merely reacting. I was orchestrating, building leverage while everyone, including my father, continued to believe I was still powerless. This careful dance of observation and subtle manipulation was exhausting, yet thrilling. The storm was gathering, and when it finally broke, I would be ready to seize control completely. Late one night, poring over the stacks of documents I had collected, I stumbled upon it, a tiny clause buried deep in the business contracts, a detail no one had ever noticed, not even my father. It was subtle, almost laughably insignificant at first glance, but I recognized its potential immediately. A legal loophole that could give me partial control of the family business if executed correctly. My heart raced, but I forced myself to remain calm. This wasn't about impulsive action. It was about precision, timing, and patience. I spent hours cross-referencing financial statements, past agreements, and correspondence, tracing patterns that revealed my father's blind spots. Every mismanaged account, every overlooked obligation, every favoritism-fueled error suddenly became a tool in my hands. I mapped out my moves meticulously, rehearsing every conversation, every subtle pressure point I could exploit. The thrill of discovery was intoxicating. For the first time, I saw the path to turning years of neglect into an opportunity for justice. Even as I strategized, I reminded myself to remain invisible. My father must never suspect the depth of my knowledge or the careful precision of my plan. I began reaching out quietly to allies who could verify and support the details I had uncovered, always framing it as casual curiosity, never revealing my intentions. By the end of the week, I had constructed a plan that was both cunning and patient. The puzzle was complete. The pieces aligned perfectly, and I could feel the momentum building. The final payoff wasn't here yet, but it was close. And when the moment came, my father, and everyone who had dismissed me would finally see the consequences of underestimating me. The family gathered for what was supposed to be a routine board meeting, but I had other plans. I arrived early, papers in hand, calm and composed, every step deliberate. My father, as always, settled into his chair with an air of unshakable authority, unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. I waited for the right moment, letting tension build naturally as the room buzzed with idle chatter and polite greetings. Every glance, every nod, every murmured good morning played into the drama I was about to unfold. When the meeting formally began, I spoke first, quietly at first, presenting data that exposed errors in recent contracts, errors that directly undermined my father's claims of flawless management. His face tightened, eyes narrowing, as I methodically laid out facts he had ignored, mistakes he had assumed no one else would notice. The room went silent, the weight of my words sinking in. Colleagues and family members exchanged stunned looks, whispering under their breath, realizing for the first time that my father's perfection was a carefully constructed illusion. Then I revealed a previously hidden clause I had discovered, one that legally granted me a voice in decisions previously denied. My tone was calm, measured, yet every word carried the force of someone who had been dismissed for too long. My father's mouth opened and closed, fumbling for words, but the room had already shifted. For the first time, he was not the center of authority. He was being questioned, exposed, and publicly undermined by the very person he had long assumed powerless. I could see the flicker of panic in my siblings' eyes, the subtle reassessment in colleagues' expressions. The whispers grew louder, and the energy in the room shifted from polite decorum to simmering recognition of the truth. I was no longer sidelined. The carefully cultivated favoritism, the years of ignoring my contributions, the assumption that I would accept my inheritance of nothing, they all unraveled in that single decisive moment. As I concluded my presentation, letting the final point hang in the air, the room erupted into murmurs of astonishment and reluctant admiration. My father sat frozen, stripped of the authority he had wielded for decades. I felt a surge of satisfaction and vindication, a quiet triumph that was more intoxicating than any applause. The first wave of justice had landed, and I could see clearly that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The day of the official announcement arrived, and I walked into the boardroom with a quiet confidence I had never allowed myself to feel before. Every eye was on me as I presented the final documents, carefully prepared and legally airtight. My father, smug and self-assured, clearly expected a routine approval, a formality he could breeze through while maintaining his illusion of control. But as I began to outline the terms, explaining how the business would now be partially under my management and how previous oversights entitled me to a significant share, the room froze. Shock rippled through the air. My father's face went pale, a flush of disbelief spreading across his features. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again, as though searching for words that simply didn't exist. My siblings gawked, mouths slack, as the reality settled in. His favoritism, his arrogance, and his assumption that I would remain powerless had all been undone in one elegant move. Every piece of leverage I had painstakingly gathered over weeks, every hidden clause, every mismanaged account, every subtle manipulation of alliances, now coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. I had reclaimed what was mine. The murmurs grew louder as colleagues whispered, nodding in approval, some even exchanging impressed glances. I felt a surge of vindication and adrenaline, the culmination of months of careful planning, patience, and strategy. My father, usually the orchestrator of control, sat stunned, unable to counter the evidence I had so methodically presented. For the first time in decades, he was forced to witness his child, whom he had underestimated and dismissed, command authority in front of everyone he thought was loyal to him. I allowed myself a small, private smile, savoring the shock and awe that rippled through the room. The tables had turned completely. The injustice that had once weighed so heavily on me had been met with a meticulously executed, irrevocable reversal. Every slight, every humiliation, every moment of neglect had led to this instant, a moment of justice that no one could dispute. And as the room settled into stunned silence, I realized that the true power wasn't in wealth or legal leverage. It was in reclaiming respect, dignity, and the right to be seen on my own terms. The room remained quiet for a moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in for everyone. My father sat rigid, the arrogance drained from his posture, replaced by disbelief and a grudging recognition. My siblings exchanged uncertain glances, some masking embarrassment, others lingering on a dawning respect. I could feel the tension between revenge and reconciliation, a delicate balance that hung in the air like a fragile thread. I had achieved what I set out to do, yet I didn't want to crush them completely. I wanted acknowledgement, not destruction. Alone in my thoughts, I reflected on how far I had come. The anger and humiliation that once consumed me had transformed into quiet strength. I realized I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. Every calculated step, every moment of patience and cunning had led to empowerment, teaching me that control comes not from compliance, but from knowledge, preparation, and self-belief. As murmurs of apology and hesitant congratulations began to ripple through the room, I felt a sense of closure. I had won, but more importantly, I had learned to value my own worth above the shifting whims of my family. The relief was profound, tempered with the understanding that relationships might remain strained, but my dignity and my voice were finally unshakable. The room buzzed with a strange mixture of awe and unease. My father, usually the center of authority, sat rigid and silent, his usual confidence replaced by a thin veneer of composure. My siblings fidgeted, some avoiding eye contact, others stealing cautious glances at me, unsure whether to celebrate or resent my triumph. I could feel the fragile tension between revenge and reconciliation hanging in the air. I didn't want to humiliate them further. I wanted recognition, a restoration of balance, a quiet acknowledgement that I was no longer powerless. As I observed them, my mind wandered through the journey that had brought me here. The humiliation, the overlooked sacrifices, the subtle favoritism, they had all been harsh teachers. I realized that what I had gained wasn't just leverage or a share of the business. It was self-respect, clarity, and an unshakable confidence in my own abilities. The victories were meaningful because they were earned, carefully and patiently, not handed to me. When my father finally muttered a strained acknowledgement, and a few siblings offered hesitant congratulations, I felt a weight lift. I had asserted myself, reclaimed my place, and discovered a power I hadn't known I possessed. The sense of closure was profound, not just in seeing them confronted with the truth, but in knowing I had grown, endured, and emerged stronger. For the first time, I felt fully seen, fully respected, and completely ready for whatever came next. Sitting alone later that evening, I let the events of the past weeks wash over me, the adrenaline finally ebbing to a quiet calm. The triumphs, the careful strategies, the subtle manipulations, they had all come at a cost, both emotionally and mentally. I thought about the hours of planning, the sleepless nights replaying every conversation, every document, every potential misstep. Revenge had demanded patience, cunning, and a steeliness I didn't know I possessed, but it had also taught me something far more valuable. My worth didn't depend on anyone's approval. I reflected on my father, my siblings, and the tangled web of favoritism and neglect that had shaped me. In exposing their mistakes and claiming what was rightfully mine, I hadn't just reclaimed assets or status. I had reclaimed myself. The satisfaction of justice was undeniable, but it was tempered with an understanding that dignity and self-respect mattered far more than any victory over others. I had proven my strength, but the real reward was internal, a confidence and clarity that no slight could ever erase. As I sat in the quiet of my own space, I felt a profound sense of closure. The journey had been painful, infuriating, and exhausting, yet it left me with something enduring. The knowledge that I could stand on my own, demand respect, and navigate life on my terms. The injustice that once defined me no longer held power. I was free, vindicated, and, for the first time in years, truly at peace. You said,